make some waves in education. I thought we could do things better. But then I kind of realized, like, I think I need to be in education to make change in education, if that makes sense. Plus, I really wanted to coach again. So that's kind of what pulled me back in. And then, of course, coming to U-High was the perfect meld of both of those things, because we're a laboratory school, and so we get a little more opportunity, I guess, to try new things than maybe a traditional public school would allow. So anyway, that was a lot to a short question.
Oh, yeah,
but,
go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I love coaching. I get a lot out of it personally. The relationships I build with the coaching staff and with the players, and getting to watch kids kind of grow up over the course of 4 years is a pretty special thing. It's really, coaches, when we're at clinics, oftentimes are like, hey, what we're doing is important. And I believe that. I do think it's important. I think it's important to be able to mentor young people. And particularly, I think athletics gives you a unique opportunity to do that you don't get even in the classroom or in lots of other places. So yeah, I find coaching to be a really special opportunity for me personally, and also really rewarding.
Wow. Yeah, so that's interesting to hear you say that you weren't sure about coming back, because I always thought that you, like, for sure were coming back. But wow. Yeah, so it's funny because in 2017, I went to basic August 22nd, and I graduated November 22nd. So when I came out of basic and I kind of like got caught up on what was going on, I was like, what? Like, Plains is where what's going on?
Yeah.
So like, kind of how was that like? Like, I want to hear the firsthand experience of that season, or running through it, because I didn't know about any of it at all.
Well, it's funny. I'm actually going to start with something that probably most of the players that played on that team don't know. So I was meeting, like I always do during an off season, trying to find new coaches and add people I think would be good for the staff. And so I was sitting down with several people, Coach Hambleton, who came on and was our D coordinator, and Trent Corton, who was our D-line coach that year. And I remember specifically talking to Q. I think I probably said something similar to Coach Hambleton, but, to Q, I was like, hey, look, we're coming off a 3-6 year, but, like, we were super young. We got a lot of talent. I think we got a chance to be pretty good. I said, I don't think we're going to win state, but I think we can make a run into the postseason, And I remember Q coming up to me, like, after the semifinal game or after the championship game, he's like, hey, do you remember when we sat down? I mean, literally in the, like, back room, the, like, secret gambling room at Westwoods, you know what I mean? That's like where I did my, like, coaching interviews, because it was, like, pretty private back there. And he was like, do you remember when you told me, you were like, hey, I think we might be pretty good, but, like, we're probably not gonna win the title. He's like, we're in the title.
Yeah.
So I think I knew that team had a real shot to be pretty special. We had a lot of guys that had played a lot of football. I mean, if you think about a couple of our team leaders that year, someone like Nick Sampson. Nick had played, he started for 2 years, but he played a ton as a sophomore. Someone like Ethan Ankenbrandt, 3-year starter. Kevin Ingram had played a ton of football for us. Kai Kralberg has started 3 years for us. Like, we had a lot of guys. I'm probably missing some, I'm so far away. So I apologize, Pleasant Plains guys, if I forgot a 3-year starter here. But we had a bunch of guys that had started 2 and 3 years. And that is like a big deal, I think, when you got a bunch of seniors who have played a bunch of football that come back. And, obviously we started the year like 2 and 3. I think you said to walk you through it, I mean, week 1, lost to Athens, but had, like, someone, I think Devin Burns was out that game. Like, I don't think we started our, like, kind of best O-line multiple weeks in a row until, like, week 6. Right, it was the first time I think we had our offensive line healthy.
People out and stuff, or
constantly injuries. None of them were, like, super serious, right? But stuff like, I think Burns's was a toe, if I remember right. And so, like, he was back, I think, in week 2 or 3, but, like, we were constantly moving guys through the, like, through the line. Man. And so, like, early on, we didn't have a lot of continuity. I mean, I remember we went into the Maroa game, which was, like, maybe week 4. So I think we were, 2-1 or something like that going in, because we lost to Athens week 1. I don't remember the order of all the games, but I remember we beat Auburn, and that was like a tight game, fourth quarter game that, like, Tristan went out at halftime with something, and Zach got a pretty serious concussion, one of our top receivers, and so like we were banged up, and like Auburn was scoring. They took the lead on us in the fourth quarter, and I remember like getting the ball back and being scared to death of them having the ball last. I think we probably got it back with like maybe 6 or 7 minutes in the game, and we like I just like changed all my play calling to try to eat the entire clock and score. And because that was a game that had been like back and forth. I mean, it was in the 40s, right? I mean, it was a long game.
Wow.
And so we were able to accomplish that. I mean, we converted a couple fourth downs. Actually, Alec Mudra had a couple big catches that game. He did. No.
That's awesome.
The producer over here. So
Yes.
like he had a couple of big you had a fourth down catch, right? I don't know if you're on the mic or not, but you had a big fourth down conversion on the last drive.
I have no recollection.
You did. But like he had a big fourth down catch. So we had a lot of guys step up, and we ended up scoring with 40 seconds left in the game, and they had no timeouts. So like literally like took the lead exactly in the
Oh my gosh.
scenario I intended when we got the ball back at that drive.
Yeah.
Like we had probably 2 fourth down conversions on that drive, and like it's funny, people that haven't coached, probably there's like being the head coach and the play caller, once you've done it a little bit, you have to like kind of be a little bit zen. Like if you watch an NFL game, Kyle Shanahan is not going crazy on the sideline, right? He is like calm.
Right.
He is like he's in a zone trying to call plays. The D coordinators sometimes are going a little nuts because that's like who they are.
Defense.
But like I got assistant coaches, like we got the ball, clock's ticking, they're just in my ears, right? And like I'm having to be like, I got it, relax. Like I remember Baesdefer like try to scream at me to call like a timeout, and I was like, dude, we want the clock. I want the clock to be as close to 0 as possible when we score, because we had like inside the 5.
Oh my.
And I was letting the clock run.
Yeah.
They didn't have any timeouts. So like that's the kind of stuff that people, you don't know that you got guys like in your ears who are freaking it, right? Because they're like feeling the pressure, and as a coach, you gotta be like, hey, chill. We're right where we want to be, So that was a big win against Auburn, big comeback win at their place, which is always tough to win down there. Lost to Moreau, super beat up, like someone like Kai, who was mostly an offensive player by his senior year. Pretty sure he started at like outside backer that game because we were like so shorthanded. So lost a real tough one to them. They were really stinking good. In fact, they played in the title game
That year?
before us.
For 2A, right?
Yeah, like they were playing when we got to DeKalb. So I think it was like 28-20, but we had the ball, kind of similar, going down to score in the fourth quarter, down 28-20, didn't get it done, but had the ball in the red zone, with an opportunity to score. Then I think the following week was Williamsville, and we were 2-2, and they were awesome. They had one of their best teams, and we went in with like 5 or 6 starters out. Not that we were necessarily going to beat them, but like we were a shell of our like selves. I felt like that night, so they blew us out. And then we were sitting there at 2-3, headed to North Mac, which for any Sangamo podcast listeners know, going to Verdon pre the new field and stuff was crazy. You never knew what you're going to get officials wise, or what the field conditions were going to be like. And so like we went and they played us super tough, even though they were, I think, struggling a little bit that year, but we were able to get out of there with a win, get to 3-3, and then we went on a little run, right? Beat New Berlin at home in another really tough game. I think it was tied at halftime. And then finished the season with a couple wins against Pittsfield and Petersburg. And so sitting there at 6-3, going to the postseason, it was like, okay, feel like our team really, like, we got Lucas Western back, we got Sam McAfee back, we got our O-line starting together, and so it felt like we were, Zach Ely had come back, like, felt like our whole team was starting to like
Pick up
feel
momentum.
itself, and get to our potential. But even early in the postseason, I think we were still feeling out like what it was like to have our whole roster.
Oh yeah. Okay.
And so like week 1, we went 6-3 and we're the last seed. I mean, that's insane. There were no 5-4 teams
At all?
in the South bracket. No, 0. So like we were the last seed
That's
at
really
6-3.
weird. I've never heard that before.
The HSA playoffs are interesting that way. So we got like a 9-0 Trenton Westland, who was from a smaller league, hadn't played the competition we had played, but like we went down there ready.
6-3 versus 9-0.
Yeah, and we were ready. And I mean, I think it was 6. It was probably it was like 7-6 or 13-6. Like we scored early and often. Honestly, I mean, we scored a lot that game. I think we scored in the 50s. But they scored they had a big touchdown to get it, to either tie it or to get within one score of us. And then I think halftime we went in 35-13 or 14, something like that. Anyway, we pulled away in that game, then came home, and Pleasant Plains had never been past the second round of the playoffs.
Yeah.
Like my first year,
Solano Unity.
my first year at Pleasant Plains as the O coordinator, right? We won the first ever playoff game at Plains by beating Auburn in the first round. That was 2012. And so when we hosted that game, we were playing Newton High School, which is where my grandpa, this is just weird how stuff happens like this. My grandpa had taught 36 years at Newton High School. Like his plaque is on the wall. He's got a plaque on the wall for teaching at Newton. That's where my dad went to high school, right? Like the Walworth name in Newton. Like if someone went down there and said, "Oh, Brody Walworth," well, they'd be like, "I had his grandpa,
Wow.
As a math teacher or whatever, grew up with his dad or his aunts or whatever." So anyway, man, they played us super tough. They had a backup quarterback, like their kid was out, and so that was a really tough game. I think we were nervous. I think we let ourselves think a little too much about scoring 50 in week 1 against a 9-0, and then B, we had Plains had never been past this round.
Yeah.
I think we put too much pressure on ourselves.
Yeah.
Ended up escaping, with a 2-point win.
Oh my gosh.
And again, if you want the recap, the very first score of the game, we marched down the field, scored, sent the extra point team out, and they went offsides. So I sent the offense back out and went for 2 and scored, and it ended up being the difference in the game because I think the final was either 28-26 or 29-27.
Oh my.
But their kicker has the all-time Illinois record for most PATs made in a row. He was automatic. So the fact that we went for 2 at the very first score of the game meant that when they had to tie it,
They had to go for 2.
they had to go for 2. They had to take their automatic kicker off the field, right? So that kind of little stuff in football, not that it was some amazing call, because I don't think that's not what I was thinking about at the time. I was going, well, Nick Sampson and our O-line, we can get a yard and a half, right? I'm not going, later in the game this is going to be some huge deal, but it ended up being that, right? I'm not a 4X chess player too often, but anyway, the third round was probably the biggest game as far as tightest competitively.
Who's
right?
that?
Carlinville, quarterfinal game at their place we had lost my first year at Plains in 2014, my first year as head coach. Well coached, had been in the title game the year before, had a lot of talent, coach's son playing quarterback. They had a really good team. And I think that was probably game plan wise, defensively, the best game plan I've probably ever been a part of, between me and Hamilton and Betts and Gates and all the Q, we put together, I think, maybe the best defensive plan, because Carlinville had been scoring 40 a game.
Wow.
Yeah, they were unbelievable.
Were they passing, running, both?
Both. They had a real nice running back. Their best price skill player was a slot receiver that they moved around and put in motion a bunch. Their quarterback was really good at he was accurate and did a good job like reading. They did a lot of zone read, bubble and stuff, and so like we really tried to hone in on that. So like to hold them to 14.
Well, that's what it was.
Yeah, the final was 20-14 in overtime.
Oh my gosh.
So it was a crazy game. Because like, we had been scoring a decent clip throughout the year, but they had really been scoring.
So it was like a defensive game, or was the offense?
It was, because I knew what they did defensively would challenge us. They were a heavy pressure, play man-to-man basically every snap of the game, and that, we really wanted to run the ball, and the way they packed the box made it really tricky for some of our run game stuff to be good. And so a lot of what we were able to do, our first touchdown was off a turnover for them.
Wow.
We picked up a fumble, and then we're able to punch it in from, I don't know, like the 20 maybe in a couple of plays. And then we had a big touchdown pass to come out of the second half to Kai. And that was a heck of a play, because I think we went in to halftime tied 7-all. Or no, up 7-6.
Oh.
Because I think they tried to go for 2. They tried to swing and gate us, and we stopped it. And so I think we were 7-6 going into half. Because when we scored, we made it 14-6, and then when they scored, they had to go for 2, and they made it 14-all. And that's where it was until overtime. Despite both teams kind of having chances, it was stressful. Like, it got to the point, I mean, pretty sure we had the lead at this time. I'm almost certain. Somebody have to go check the film. But I'm pretty sure we were up 14-6. They punted it and pinned us, like, at the 1.
Oh.
We got it to, like, the 9 or, the 10, where it was, like, we literally needed inches to get a first down. And for anyone that knows me, I mean, I will go for it anywhere on the field. I don't care. If I'm confident I have a play that's going to work, we're going. I had every coach on our staff, like, it was like 4th and less than 6 inches, or approximately that. Every coach on the staff was like either coming down to me or in the headset telling me to punt, because they knew I was going to go for it. I was ready to call the play. But like, it took every single voice on the staff to get me to not punt.
I
wish I would have gone for it, because I'm serious. Like, what happened was we had a so-so punt that was like, I don't know, like 30 yards, and they scored in like 3 plays, or whatever it was, and tied it. And I was like,
what was the point of that?
Well, we punt it, like, okay, they get the ball in plus territory. Well, okay, they score from the 30 or they score from our 10. Who cares?
Just more time off the
clock. But if I
really
can get 6 inches here,
still,
it's our ball. Yeah, exactly. So anyway, that game came down to overtime. We had 2 really nice plays. We got defense. We won the toss, took defense, 2 really good stops. I think they had 3rd and 6. And of course, if we stop them on 4 downs, if we can hold them out of points, we got a good kicker that we could have just kicked probably first play. We didn't, but we could have, right? So like, if we hold them to 0 high school overtime, I feel great. So anyway, we got them 3rd and 6, and I'm guessing they felt like had to score a touchdown. Well, they had a good kicker too. And Sampson, I mean, we were man, kind of like our cover 2 man that we played down by the goal line, and Nick is free. Both our inside backers are free. Nick just read the QB, did exactly what we teach him to do. Quarterback tried to squeeze it into their best player, and Nick undercut it, picked it off.
Really?
Yeah. So like, get a turnover so that they're at 0, and then we scored in 2 plays.
2 plays?
Yeah, 2 plays. So
what round was that again? That was the 3rd round?
That was 3rd round. It was quarterfinals at their place. Kai had like a quarterback's wildcat sweep for the touchdown.
To win the game?
To win the game.
In overtime?
And yeah, in overtime. And then him and like the whole team like ran down the track like in front of the fans. It was pretty sweet.
Oh, yeah.
I had 3 of my good friends from high school were like at that end zone filming it.
Really?
Like, yeah, it was nuts, man. It was
awesome.
It was a crazy day. So that was a lot of fun. That was probably our best win in the postseason. I mean, it's hard to say, like, but like from a competitive standpoint, I think that was like the most competitive game, the most even match, because Carlinville was really stinking good.
Yeah.
So then semifinals, I mean, that was the most fun because we just romped.
Yeah.
I mean, 41-2.
That was the score?
That was the score.
It was a safety.
They pinned us, or sorry, we got a
Okay.
goal line stand. So like we marched down the field, like literally. I think Nick, you should look up the 1450 highlight. People are probably already getting tired of my storytelling. I mean, you asked me to go play by play.
Go ahead, go crazy.
So, but if you look up the 1450 video, I mean, Nick probably ran 6 or 7 for like 70 yards on the first series. I mean, it was literally Samson. I think Kai like had one jet sweep and then it was like back to Samson. And so he scored. I mean, we just marched down the field and scored, looked invincible. And then they started marching. They were under center, triple option, team with a tight end. And so they started marching down the field and we get this goal line stand, right? Where they had 2 plays from the 1 and couldn't score. But then we flub a block, get tackled in the end zone. So it's flipping 7-2, okay? And we kick off, right, because we have to. And this is where, like, special teams matter, as my old this little Mitch Thomas shout-out, special teams, third of the game, matters. Like, we kick off, and I think we had Tristan was the one that recovered it. So we did a normal kickoff, and they, like, fumbled it. Tristan, who was on our gunner, ran down and recovered it. So we got the ball, like after a safety, we ended up getting the ball back and then punched it in. I think it was, and we were up maybe 21-2 at half. It wasn't like crazy out of control, but then like we were firmly in control of the game. And so second half, we really shut them down defensively, and we just kept scoring. I mean, so they were the big ground and pound team, and they were a really good football team, I think. But that day, the level at which our team played was just the best, highest we had played by far those last 2 weeks going into the title game. I mean, I think Nick ran for 150, and Western had another 80 or whatever. I mean, we were just pounding the salt, man. I'm telling you, it was a lot of fun. So anyway, had a pick 6. Nick Sunley, sophomore, had a pick 6 that game. That pretty much iced it. I think that made it 35-2, and then Western had a big run to should have made it 40, but Kai like weirdly missed a PAT. So we didn't get the clock to run. But anyway, so that was a big win at home. Go to the title game, right? And then state week. It's Thanksgiving weeks. First time I'd ever been through that. I think we had a lot of fun, and boys did a lot of haircuts and whatever else. And then went and played Immaculate Conception, who had some serious dudes. I think we played our butts off. Like, it was 6-0 at half in a game that most people probably would have guessed we would have been getting blown out at halftime. Had an opportunity to score. We turned them over early, and then we turned it right back to them. But, ran the ball effectively in the first half, and then kind of got behind momentum a little bit in the second half and ended up losing 35-0. But felt like we played well, thought we coached well. We just ran up against some horses that we hadn't really seen, and that's how it ended.
Wow. Well, thanks for telling me all that. But when when you're going in a game, or like when you're at a game where it's like overtime and it's like super crunch time, how do you maintain, like, keep in your like track of timeouts and where we're at? And like, is that just from repetition or practice, you think, or do you actually like sit and think about this beforehand? Like, if we get in this situation, when am I gonna go timeout? When am I not?
I think both. I mean, we do rep 2-minute drill and stuff like that. We don't work on overtime very much because high school overtime is actually like easy from that point of view, and that like you got 4 downs from the 10 to score and 4 downs from the 10 to stop the other team, right? So it's like you're not up against the clock like you are in like a fourth quarter situation. So like we practice 2-minute drill practice. We work on timeouts. Do we have no timeouts? We have one timeout. What's our spike call? Trying to coach receivers to, get it out of bounds. And if you don't get it out of bounds, run it into the official and actually like hand him the ball so that the ball's not spilling around on the ground. Those are all things that we practice, right? And then I do think about it in terms of like trying to prep for that kind of stuff. And also like one thing I've done since I was a little kid, which is probably why I coach, is like, I totally judge NFL and college coaches on when they shouldn't be calling timeouts. You know what I mean? Like I think about that a lot. So, I'm a Cowboys fan, and for whatever reason, the Cowboys can't hire a coach that knows when to call timeout. Now I'm on a podcast here telling an NFL coach what they should and shouldn't do. But like for whatever reason, I mean, those guys are getting paid millions, and some of them can't figure out when they should call timeout and when they shouldn't. Even though I don't. There are some times when it's hard, but like in general,
it just comes to you.
It shouldn't be that hard to be like, this is the time to do it, and this is the time we should roll the dice.
Yeah.
I mean, think back to I don't know how much you remember Dallas like 2 years ago, had the ball with no timeouts and like 14 seconds left, and decided that because they had practiced this, that it would be easy for them to run a quarterback draw with 14 seconds and then hand the ball to the official and get everybody reset and lined up and spike it. And they ran out of time, of course, because that's
14 seconds is not
14 seconds is like literally the bare minimum. So like they were counting on an absolutely perfect everything, right? Perfect time when Dak takes the slide. Perfect time for everybody to get back, right? Perfect time for the officials to spot the ball, like as if the other team might not lay down there for an extra half second or whatever. And they didn't get the playoff, right? And like McCarthy at the end of the game was like, well, we practiced it and it worked. Well, yeah, I mean, I've practiced a bunch of stuff and it worked, and I still don't think it's game ready.
Yeah.
So like, I think that's like the level of at which even people that are getting paid to do it struggle. Right? It is a tough thing. And so like it does take reps and practice, which matters, but it also takes like analyzing like what's going on in games and what's the specific situation.
Yeah. So that's like kind of going into another question with the similar thing. X's and O's, like game planning is a huge part of coaching and everything.
Yeah.
If you get into a game where your game plan doesn't work, how do you have you had that happen to you before?
Oh yeah, 100%.
Because I've seen it before to where like coaches, not like any program I've been a part of, but just like as a fan, who they have a hard time like recognizing their plans not working and adjusting. Like how do you go about that when it happens to you?
I will say it's really hard in football because football, we depend on our week of practice to set us up for success, right? Like, having now been a basketball assistant the last couple years, I think it's a lot easier to like maneuver because you've played some zone teams in the past. You've played some teams that do little different things, and so you tend to have answers, and it's easier to like call timeout, get on the board, and be like, hey, remember this thing that we did 2 weeks ago against this other team? We got to start doing that again, right? Whereas in football, it's so specific to what you think that team is going to do and like how they have tended to operate on film, that if they show up and do something completely different, it's sometimes hard to be like, hey, let's run these plays we haven't practiced in 3 or 4 weeks, because like all we do is practice the plays we think we're going to run, right? So like I do think that's tricky. And so making sure you still practice your like, even if you're playing a team that's played zone every snap of the year defensively, you still got to practice your man beaters, right? Like, because somebody might come out, like, actually good example for us this year, at UI was playing Lincoln week 8. Lincoln had showed 80% zone, whatever, 85% zone. I saw one game where they played man, right, in the like scout. And so like we had a bunch of our zone stuff in. That was like the primary game plan, but we had a little bit of our man stuff, held back. And so like they came out and played cover 0, press everywhere, blitz in the house, right, trying to prevent Alec, our quarterback, from having time, basically, right? It seemed like the game plan. They had some dudes that could run. They put their fastest dude at the, outside backer and said, we're coming after him. And so, like, that took us a couple of series, but we were able to adjust and end up, force them back into zone. Then we were able to run our zone stuff. Then they went back to man, and we went back to the man stuff, right? So, like, we were able to go max protect, basically, and get matchups we wanted.
Yeah.
And that allowed us to get the ball rolling offensively.
Yeah.
No, but they were up 14-0 on us, and partly, at least, because, like, they came out in a look. We were like, we knew they might, but didn't think they would.
Yeah.
Right? So I think it's one of those things that, like, if you prep for everything, you're actually not going to be prepped for what you want to be successful with, right? So, like, you don't want to be, I don't think it's right to say, well, you just got to prepare for anything.
Yeah.
I think that's actually bad game planning,
Mm-hmm.
right? I think you should prepare for what you expect to see, and then if teams have done other stuff or have shown other little things, maybe kind of have a semi plan for that, right? Like, so, like, that's what my card usually looks like, is I've got, like, the main game plan, and then if I think a team has, like, some other stuff they've shown, maybe they're primarily a cover 3 team, but they have shown some man, then I'll have, like, a series of man calls down in the, like, a different part of my card. But really, I think the biggest thing is noticing that a team is doing something different, right? Like, you have to be, like, observant enough to not just stare at your card and go, this is what we're running, right? Because, football coaches,
a lot of things to look at and pay attention to,
and football coaches sometimes are notorious for being like, we're just going to do what we do. And, that's great when you are, like,
when it works,
big and strong, and, maybe you're used to being the biggest, strongest, fastest team out there. Like, then sure, you can just do what you do. But, like, if you depend on out thinking and out scheming and out formation people to be successful, then you got to be ready to make adjustments like that.
Yeah. This is like, U-High is essentially the second program you've inherited and kind of built up. Would you say?
Yeah.
What do you think is, like, the first thing when you touch down at a new place that, like, program-wise, you have to, like, pay attention to and make sure it's correct? Is it, like, the numbers, or just, like, the players themselves, or, like, kind of the community outreach, parents? Because there's so many things. Like, I try to think about, like, all the things that you kind of do, like, just from last season, kind of being around, and there's a lot to take care of. Like, it is pretty much like an all-year thing.
Mm-hmm.
So what's, like, the first things you put your hands on when you get into a new program?
Well, both were I mean, they were different situations, because Plains, I was already there, right? I was a known commodity to the kids. I was a teacher in the building. I was the offensive coordinator the 2 previous years, right? So, like, there I kind of, and it was my first head coaching job. So it's one of those things, sometimes you don't know what you don't know, right? Until you're in it. So there, I mean, I will say the very first thing was all about numbers, 100% numbers. Because we had gone, my Coach Pugh's first year, we were in the maybe around 50 ish players, something like that.
2012.
Yeah, 2012. But then lost a senior class of, like, 18 or something, and didn't have a huge freshman class, and so, like, we were at, like, 32 the next year. It's not enough in 3A, and so, like, when I took over, it was all about the hallways, trying to get kids out. And I think we had 60 that first year or thereabouts, and I don't think I ever had under 60 my 4 years at Plains. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We were always right in that 60 to 70 number. But, like, the biggest thing I'll say to that question is, like, when I got out, I think one of the things that I had thought about a lot if I ever got back in was, like, what would I do different, or, like, what did I learn from being a head coach at Plains that would inform how I would take over a new program, right? And so, like, that's where, you and Coach Mudra over here as coaches, like, have gotten to experience it now. It was all about culture, so, like, it was not about X's and O's. And I think that's one area that, like, when I took over at U-High, every single thing that we did was about building culture in a certain way. which, like, what does that do? That leads to numbers, right? It leads to people wanting to be a part of your program. It leads to internal leadership, right, from the players, right? It leads to high expectations. So, like, created these 4 values that we still use: family, service, relentlessness, and excellence. And so, like, building culture and doing it the right way and trying to get kids to respect and care about one another as teammates and as people first, and then, being football players or athletes second. I think that is the recipe that I have, like, developed / bought into for building a football program, because, like, you're not always going to have elite athletes. You're not always going to have the best, the most talented, the biggest, the strongest kids on the field. And so, like, if you make it all about winning or all about numbers or all about something measurable, some product on the field, well, what's a player's experience or coach's experience when we're losing? Or when, someone's not getting the playing time they expect to get, or, you get beat by 40, or the numbers are low, or, whatever, like, negative thing can happen in football, which is a lot.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't have the culture there as, like, the thing that we all care about, that's when people start sniping at each other.
Yeah.
Pointing fingers, blame, right? That negativity builds, right? People start to develop poor attitudes, right? They start to slam their helmet. They start to do stuff that then becomes cancerous to a team, right? And so, like, I think you just want to avoid being all about winning or all about getting kids college scholarships or all, like, there are a ton of things you want to be doing, but should flow from having great culture.
Yeah.
And I think that's, like, the thing I did when I took over at U-High, and I think it's paying off. Not only did we have success on the field last year, right, in year 3, making it to the playoffs, first time ever in some state 8, all that, like, we could talk about that, but, like, our numbers, we had almost 80 football players in the program, had 40 when we took over, right? If you ask the kids what their favorite things are, they love playing football, of course, but, like, they love Saturday morning breakfast.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, there are just things we've built in that are just as important to them, I think, as their, like, on-field experience. Because it's fun running out under the lights on Friday no matter what, right? Those experiences they're going to get just by playing. But what are we doing as coaches to support them as young men? What are we doing to, like, make sure that the program we're building is something that everyone can feel a part of, and it's not just reserved for the handful of best players,
right?
That kind of stuff. I think about that a lot. Like, what's our 25th player thinking about? What's our 40th player on our roster thinking about and feeling about football? It's easy to coach the stars,
right?
The guys that are producing, but, like, what's we had 79 players on our roster last year, so I think it's like 50 on the varsity roster or something like that. I mean, like, what's player 48, 49, and 50 feeling about football?
This is something that Taylor and I talk about a lot, because, like, the culture, just being, like, a young kid playing football, because even down the road, I mean, I agree with what you said about, like, making sure that they're being, like, kind of brought up with role models and good morals and values is really good, and not even just as far as, like, becoming, I don't know, solid in yourself, but also the things I've learned through football have helped me. Like, for example, in the Army, when I took over a team, no one else in my team had spent time in a weight room. So, like, when we'd go to do PT, I was the only one that knew how to, operate in a weight room.
Yeah.
Because from playing football all the time. So I had taught, like 5 or 6 guys, like, just simple workouts, stuff to do, just because they'd never been in one before, never had, like, been a part of a program who taught them how to use a weight room. So just, like, things like that is I have learned or kind of look back on just from being in my life, like, man, football really showed me this.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. I mean, that's what any coach, any teacher will tell you. One of the best things we get are when former players, former students reach out 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, whatever, you get the email, you get the text, whatever it is now, right? And they're like, hey, that time we spent together was important and meaningful for me. You know, like when you get a 25 or 30-year-old saying that to you, you know, that matters. That's why we do what we do. Because like sometimes when kids are 15, 16, 17, they're like, you know, they're out there, they're doing their thing, but they're not reflecting.
Mm-hmm.
They're not going, oh, this is like, you know, coach is doing this, and it's really important for me for my time in the Army or my time when I'm a CEO somewhere, or, you know, whatever it is. But oftentimes that comes from reflection, from life experience. And so like we are trying to prep that for sure, you know, like trying to convince kids that it's important to get up at 6 a.m. to come lift weights is hard.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the only ways you can do that is if they're bought into the culture of your program, right? If they believe in what you're doing. And then that kind of mentality, I think, does matter. You know, the kids that aren't doing that, not that it's wrong, but like, who's preparing for like life after high school? What are people going to be like if they haven't sacrificed a little bit for a group effort? You know what I mean? I think that's like a tricky thing. Not that everybody has to play sports. It's not all sport, right? You have to play sports to learn that. But I do think sports have a unique place in our American society in particular.
Yeah.
As far as like being that place where you have to like kill your own ego a little bit to be part of something bigger.
Yeah.
You know, and football in particular has to do that. I mean, it's a lot of people out there. You know, it's you are truly one piece of the puzzle. You know, in basketball, you can have one or two guys that dominate, but like even if you've got a great quarterback or a great receiver or a great D lineman or whatever, they can't win the game by themselves.
Yeah.
In football,
Definitely.
You know, not really in any team sport, but in football in particular, like you can have the fastest dudes, right? But if you don't have a line that's going to block, doesn't matter.
Have you been a teacher the entire time you've been coaching?
No. I started coaching when I was in college. I was 19, coaching at Arcola.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I've been a teacher 10 or 11, maybe.
Because I heard you talking
12.
about like preparing them for entering the world, and I kind of want to talk about education because you know, that's your, would you say that's like your, almost your life's work essentially?
Yeah. In some sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Because I was talking about this in the last episode. Riley, he came up here, but I don't know if you know him, Riley O'Connell, but we had started talking about like after high school and going into the world or whatever, and I want to know what you think about this because I remember thinking in high school, like, because I wasn't really good at like science or math. I was good at like reading and history, but like science and math, I really had a hard time with, and I felt like a dumb kid because I wasn't good at those things. And I mean, some of it was effort, you know, sure. But I mean, like math, I really did try, but I just did not get it. And so like, I felt like a dumb kid, and I felt like football was like one of the only things that I could like outlet to, or sports even, but really football that I was good at. And it felt good to be a part of something that I'm also good at, you know what I mean? And it really took me into where I got into the Army when I realized like, oh, I'm not dumb. I just I wasn't good at those things, you know? And then I started doing more like competitions and stuff in the Army, and I realized like, oh, I just hadn't found my groove yet. So my question for you would be like about the education system. What do you like about it? And then if you were king for a day, it might be a lot, but what would you kind of switch up? And because I don't know if you said this, but someone mentioned it to me before about instead of having like the Common Core, maybe have like kids take a series of tests or something along the way to have them go into more like avenues specific to what they're good at, or I don't know.
That's more the European model. Tracking is what that's called, right? Like kind of testing into certain things and then being put on certain tracks, right? And so in Europe, you know, not every country is exactly the same, but in general, there are like multiple types of high schools essentially, and you get tracked into like which type you tend to go to, right? So like, are you on the like I'm going to college route? Are you on the like I'm going to learn a skill to go be a plumber, a technician, computer, you know, like whatever. So that's a very European model, the kind of tracking and placing kids based on testing, which I think is okay, but that's not, when I get to the king for the day part, I'll say why I wouldn't do that. But like, I think the best thing about education is the amount of people. It's the people, the teachers, the administrators. I mean, everyone's had a great teacher, everyone's had a bad teacher, but even your best teacher to your worst teacher, almost everybody in education, in the business, the profession of education, cares about kids. And like, that to me is like the ultimate source of successful education, is that it is very labor intensive, right? You could not get a good education just like sitting in front of a laptop, right? Have an AI teach you.
Yeah,
like, I don't believe that, right? You could get the material, it could probably teach you math to some extent, right? But that like human connection and the social aspect of education is also like critically important. And so I think like what education does well is it surrounds kids with people who care about them and care about their success, right? And provides that support, whether it's academic or social or emotional, right? I think that is where like public school in particular does good things. I think school is geared toward, and this is like good and bad, I guess, it's traditional public education, which I guess for me now sitting here is mostly like a negative, but like what it does well is it trains people to like write and read and do like logical thinking in a very like strict way. All right. And so like a modern kind of public school, in my opinion, appeals or serves maybe, I don't know, I'll be generous and say 40% of a given school population are like motivated and do well in the environment of like reading, taking notes, doing logical thinking, writing essays, the kind of typical like how I get assessed in school, right? And all that is basically built on like, how do I get into college? And that to me is where the school system, if I get my wand, where the school system breaks down is that it has become a training ground essentially only for college prep. And so like, I think we've lost the forest for the trees essentially in making college preparation like the end all be all of education.
Right.
And so like, what I would encourage the listeners and viewers to do if they're interested in this is like, there are a lot of like smarter, better people who have had a lot more time to think about this than me, who have spoken at length about education reform or revolution. And so like, I will point them to Sir Ken Robinson. He's got a couple of TED Talks, and at what was at one time one of the most, if not the most viewed videos on YouTube, called Changing Education Paradigms.
It was a TED Talk?
I think the YouTube thing was like one of those marker board,
Okay.
what I mean? Like, it's part of his TED Talk in the background.
Oh, sure.
And then it's like the marker board, like
his display,
animated drawing thing on the front, where somebody's like doing the like animation on a whiteboard.
Oh, okay.
You know what I'm talking about? It's a phenomenal 15 minutes or so of like just real clear thinking about the education system. And so like, what I agree with from Sir Ken is that like what education has become is a sort of assembly line system, right? Where we kind of say everything is going to be based on how old you are, right? As to like how good you should be at something in school, right? That like each year we're going to deposit a certain amount of knowledge into your, box, brain, whatever you want to call it. And that by the time you're done with 12 years of that, you should be ready for the world. And so like that kind of assembly line mentality, the bells, the kind of like everything's in its own, like English, math, social studies, science, right? Everything's kind of separated into its disciplines. That's all the disciplines and all that's very collegiate. But what I think we lose in public education is that learning is much broader than reading, writing, and logic. And so, like, I think it's important to be able to, like, say your thoughts in written form, right? I think that is, like, a critical skill that we teach. And that's one thing education does pretty darn well, right? But, like, I think learning, if you think about a little kid, and this is what Robinson gets into and does a really good job. If you think about a little kid, they are excited to go to school.
Right.
They love their teacher. They're excited to be there. They're hugging them. They're raising their hand. They're curious. They're asking questions. And by the time, right, and I don't think it's automatic that that population should be down to like 20% of students by the time they get to be a junior and senior in high school. If you think back to your junior and senior years, I mean, what are most students doing? And like most students aren't curious and like raising their hand every 5 seconds to ask like a bunch of questions.
I was say 20% even maybe high.
It depends where you're at.
Yeah.
You know, and what class you're in. AP classes are going to be different than a, you know, standard class. Like, so there's like differences in some of that. But like, I think what education does poorly is it pushes people's innate sense of curiosity about the world out for there's a right answer and this is the one way I expect you to get to that answer, right? Or even two ways, right? And like even, you know, there are some phenomenal educators out there who do a lot of like inquiry-based work, and I think even the like most inquiry-based educator still tends to function in a system that forces people toward conformity and forces people toward compliance. And I think like most of public education tends to come down to like, am I conforming and complying to the things I'm asked to do, and not necessarily thinking for myself and not necessarily being curious about what's out there in the world and how I can make connections between different disciplines, right? Because like social studies and English and science and math constantly overlap in the real world. I think we do a very poor job in public education of like making that a reality. Same thing with, you know, something like art, something like, you know, physical education or fitness, right? Well-being. I mean, these things are all intertwined in the real world. And yet we have classes that are like very specific and don't allow for a lot of that crossover and overlap. And so I think we just push out the curiosity over time in education, and replace it with compliance and conformity. And so thinking, like, I teach psychology, or, you know, I'm about to go back into teaching psychology. I've taught psychology for a long time, previous places. Just thinking about that, like, there are a couple of psychological things at work here. One is, like, the difference between external and internal motivations, right? And so, like, if we think about human motivation, internal, right, innate motivation is much more powerful than external motivators. And so like getting paid, for example, is an external motivator. Everyone works to get paid, but not everybody is like motivated by their job, right? People don't always get excited about their job, but they do it because
the external motivator
of the external motivator. But people who are innately motivated, right, who are fulfilled by their work, care less about how much money they're making.
Do you think that like ambition and that drive is something natural, or you think that's something that has to be built in someone?
Drive how?
Just ambition for success, I guess.
Well, but that's kind of what I'm saying. I don't think you have to have an ambition to succeed from a financial point of view.
Gotcha.
Right? I don't think that's innate. I think what people search for are fulfillment, purpose, and autonomy. And so like innate motivation tends to come from some combination of my ability to control what I'm doing, right? My level of autonomy, my ability to master that thing and how much purpose I get out of doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, if you can combine those three things in some way, those tend to be very motivating and lead people to want to do that more, regardless of what the external motivator might be.
Sure.
Right? So, like, if you think about artists, for example, not always a group of people who are making money hand over fist.
That's true.
Right? In fact, usually the opposite.
Yeah.
Right? Same thing with teachers. Teachers are not, like, well known for making lots of money, and yet what people still do it. And in fact, people tend to get a lot of fulfillment out of being a teacher.
Yeah, a lot of times you hear teachers that have been doing it for 20 years, 30-year teachers. That's what I mean. I remember, like, being in high school, a lot of teachers have been there for a long time, you know. But yeah.
And so basically, to get back to the, like, education question, I think we should focus more on developing curiosity, developing opportunities for students to find things that are purposeful, that they feel like they have autonomy to do, and that they feel like they have opportunities to master. And so again, going back, like your example of math, there's a thing in psychology called learned helplessness, which is this idea that if you fail at something multiple times, you learn, literally, right? You develop a sense internally of, I'm bad at that. That's called learned helplessness, which then creates the instinct to avoid that thing.
Yeah.
Right? And so seriously, like, if you think about it, like, if you and I were, you know, born the same year, I happen to be a really strong math student and you're not, but we're taking the same math classes essentially because we are, like, the same age.
Yeah.
Right? Now, eventually you get to high school and there are different levels and stuff like that. Like, I understand that, but, like, you are expected to keep up with a certain pace of math, essentially, just based on your, like, literal when you were born. And so, like, if you're not quite ready for Algebra 1 or geometry when you walk into your first day of high school, you're going to struggle because everyone's expected to have, like, some algebra skills when they walk in.
I know, like, one of the biggest few complaints that I hear from people that I went to school with or other people I've talked to kind of about this is people say it just cranks you out to work a 9 to 5, or people will say, like, complain about the actual content of the class. Like, why are we learning about obtuse triangles instead of what's a good loan percentage on a car, or what's a good APR, or how do we calculate our good house mortgage taxes instead of, what do you think about that?
I'm sympathetic to that, but 16-year-olds may say they want to do APR on a car. Can you imagine trying to get a room full of 16-year-olds to be like, all right, we're going to learn how to calculate the percentage of a mortgage now.
So who do you think?
Right? Like, you see what I'm saying? Like, that goes back to the, like, fulfillment thing. That's not purposeful to a 16-year-old. Now, people, when they become 25 and they're trying to buy their first house, they then go, well, I wish I would learn this in high school. Well, some things you just got to learn by being out in the world and kind of doing.
That's what I'm about to say. Whose responsibility is it to teach, like, the kind of more things like that are not taught in school? Is it the person of the individual to learn them themselves? Is it on the parents to teach them? Because, I mean, that's what I've heard people argue before. Is it
to some extent it is the person, but that's where I think if you build if school were fun and exciting and people, like, got to enjoy learning, I mean, that to me is, like, the hardest thing that I watch as a teacher is people, you know, when you just see kids who are, you can just tell they just don't want to be there. And, like, to me, learning, it is so fulfilling. It's so fun. Like, people love to learn, just not always what school is trying to get them to learn. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so, like, trying to re-engage as educators with, like, it's okay for school to be fun and exciting. Like, we should want, like I think as educators, we should look at how many people would say school is, like, not fun, and we should be shocked by that. Like, if you think about, like, how fun it is to go learn something new when you're in charge of choosing that, that's, like, one of the best things you can do, whether it's learning how to, like, cook. For me, like, during the pandemic, like, took up miniature painting. I'd never thought I'd be miniature painting ever, right? I thought, well, why would I spend time doing that? And all of a sudden I'm like watching all these YouTube videos. I'm like super motivated like to do this now. And so like that's been a lot of fun doing that journey. Well, Brody, how that's not going to help you get into college. I go, well, maybe that particular skill wouldn't, but the excitement and curiosity that brings for learning translates over into things that maybe I'm less excited about if I feel like I have control over those and can find purpose and mastery, right? So like going back to math, right? It's probably the biggest like thing. People are like, well, why do I have to do side angle side or whatever? I can't answer that specific question. Like I've never had to use it as an adult, but right, a math teacher, and I think many educators would say, well, it is teaching a certain set of thinking skills that help people in other ways. And so like my pushback always to any teacher, including myself, is like, well, how can I make that feel more like the real world, right? How can I use a person's motivation to get them excited about learning these sets of skills that we think are important for them? And so I think a lot of that comes down to like, are we prepping them for college or are we prepping them to be thinkers, right? And lifelong learners, things like that. So like if I got my magic wand, I would basically turn every traditional public high school into something that looks like High Tech High in San Diego or a big picture learning school like the one I interned at in Issaquah,
What does it
Washington.
look like?
So they're similar but slightly different. So High Tech High has a couple different things going on, but the main thing they do is they take subject areas and smash a bunch of them together. So instead of being a social studies teacher, you are a I'm gonna forget the term they use for it, but basically they take English and social studies and make you have like a dual degree in those, right? And so you have like a social studies English teacher, and then you have like science math or science digital arts or what, like people combine different things. And so like basically a cohort of 50 to 60 students will have 2 teachers essentially for a semester.
Okay.
Right. They'll have other stuff going on. Like I'm oversimplifying here for the sake of a podcast, but if you and I were on the same block, right? If we were in the same cohort, we would have 2 teachers, one that's kind of like social studies English, one that's say science math or science something else. And all 50 of us would work in, 2 groups of 25 on a semester long or year long project.
Okay.
That those 2 teachers combine to like work with us on.
Oh, wow. That's pretty cool.
And so like when I was out there and visited, one of the classrooms that I observed was working on a digital magazine for climate change. And so like between the 2 classes, right, the kind of like social studies English side was working on the like helping them write, helping them navigate sourcing and that sort of stuff. So all the same stuff you would do kind of in a normal English class or social studies class, but instead of like we're doing this unit and this unit, there was a semester-long project that the kids were literally in charge of writing like a literal magazine that was going to be published.
I think that's probably better because it's the day-to-day, turn in this paper, this assignment. That's like, I hate check the block work.
100%.
You know what I mean?
Yep. And so like, and they got to kind of choose their own groups and figure out what they were like going to work on specifically. And then in the science class, they were actually developing, right? Like they were like forced to be scientists in a way that they had to develop their own recyclable materials, essentially. Like they had to take things that would normally get thrown in the trash and like try to figure out how to reuse them in a way, right? And that became part of the thing they had to write about, right? Was this work they were actually like scientifically developing in some sense. And so like that magazine got published, right, as a real world authentic project. You see what I'm saying? And so like when you tell a kid, hey, this thing is going out into the world, whether you do it well or not, and you're gonna get judged on, you're gonna get compared to the other articles that are being written, the other work other students are being. And again, you're not expecting every kid to like achieve at the same level, but you are saying if you don't hold yourself to some standard, it's gonna be obvious, right? And it's gonna be public.
Mm-hmm. This kind of reminds me of like how I felt. I feel like this is just more than just kids too, because when I was in Kansas I was working a paperwork desk job, and I'd have like my to-do stack and my complete stack, and I just work to time, and I wouldn't work to standard, I worked to time. So whenever it was like 5 p.m., I'd just go home, come back the next day. There was no goal, there was no clear product or something I was working towards, and that's why I love doing this so much, like the movies and production and stuff, because I have like finished products. There's like a goals I'm working towards, and like I can see that progress throughout instead of just working the time.
Absolutely. And I think like, thinking about big picture learning. So like High Tech High still does things in a kind of like thing that would be recognizable. There's still 25 kids in a classroom. There's still kind of a teacher, like there's still enough elements of like a traditional school that like, it's not like, oh my God, there's doing something insane. Whereas if you walk in a big picture school, like big picture learning, people don't even realize it's public education.
Really?
Yeah, because it is
classrooms, or how's it formatted?
It is almost all driven by individual projects. So like kids are working either individually or in, say, groups of 2 or 3 typically. They have a facilitator, not a teacher. So they have an advisor, essentially. Okay. Their advisor has, each teacher in the school is an advisor. That is like their role. And so I don't teach a set of classes. I have a set of 17 students who I advise.
Oh, that's cool.
Every kid is expected to produce projects. I think depending on each school is slightly different, 2 to 3 times a year where they have exhibitions. And so like basically in the time between when school starts and the first exhibition of the year is, right, which is like finals essentially, I have to like work with my advisor to develop a project that I'm going to work on. I have to choose the set of like competencies is what they call them, learning standards essentially, that I'm going to like identify as ones I'm going to like hit and master through this project I'm going to do, right? And then they're also working on that through internships. So Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, students are in the building. Their typical school day is like they go to advisories for I think 45 minutes is the school I was at. Then they have an hour and a half of work time basically that they call exploratory time, where they like, if I need a 3D printer, I go to the 3D printer lab. If I need to work in the wood shop, I go to the wood shop. If I am writing, I go to the room where the teacher is like the writing expert who's going to help me.
So they have just the open facilities that can just be used.
Yeah. And so each classroom is not like where a teacher teaches a class. It's where certain parts of a production would take place, right? And so then there's lunch, and then when they come back, there's more advisory, and then usually there's like a block of time that's called like a crash lab or a design lab, where each week they're doing, say, a 4-week civil rights unit, but I opt into those. Maybe I'm taking Taekwondo, right, as one of my 4-week like crash labs or whatever.
That's really cool.
And so like that's kind of how the school is set up. And then when it comes to Tuesdays and Thursdays, those are internship days. So students are also responsible for finding with their advisor their own internship that's outside of school.
In the real world.
And so on Tuesdays and Thursdays, they're expected to be in an internship. And if they don't have an internship, they're in the building working with their advisor, finding an internship.
That sounds good to me, honestly. I like that.
So it's like a totally different way of doing school, right? High Tech High is like still has enough recognizable forms of like traditional public education, but they have exhibition day, right? They're not final exams that you have, like, parents are invited to the building. Everyone's got projects that they've worked on for a whole semester and that are community driven or world driven, real world things, and like you gotta show publicly what you did or didn't do. I think that's really powerful.
How do you feel about like when students utilize, this is always a classic argument, like, why can't I use my calculator in the math room, or why can't I use ChatGPT on my assignments?
You're asking me too many math questions.
All right, well,
I'm not a
I'll
math
stop
teacher.
talking about math.
I don't want to bash math
I'm-
teachers, okay? I love you all. Especially you, Chris Peterson.
That's hilarious.
Okay, I want to talk about that. If I'm writing a research paper, and I use ChatGPT, I feel like that's just problem solving. If I have the resources available to me, because never in the real world am I gonna be hired for a job and then be like, oh, but you can't use this or you can't use that.
I think it depends what the goal is. If the goal is to write a paper, then the goal is for you to write the paper. And that's where ChatGPT, right? To me, that would be wrong.
Okay.
Right? If the goal is for Mason Kaufman or Brody Walworth to like come up with their own series of claims and arguments that they then have to support, right? That's a skill that I have to learn how to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I need to do that on my own. Where I think we're too strict with ChatGPT when we're talking about papers is like ChatGPT, like I use it as a teacher because it is so much faster than like Google searching if I'm trying to find specific sets of information.
Absolutely.
Right. And so like if I want to find, for example, I've never taught philosophy before and I'm teaching philosophy this semester, probably poorly. But like if I want to like find out some resources I can use for philosophy, it might take me 45 minutes to an hour to like comb Google, hone my search, read through certain things to see if it's any good or not. Whereas like if I get the right like sentence into ChatGPT, it will like plan 3 lessons for me.
Yeah.
Now I might adjust those or whatever, but like it is a phenomenal resource for like saving time for like looking at resources, finding for like research, right? Doing the research side of things. So like for that, I think we should absolutely be like encouraging, not to mention the Google search has gotten unbelievably bad.
Yeah, it has.
It's so full of ads and paid, what goes at the top. It's not a reliable tool like it used to be.
Right.
Like a lot of the internet, it's been taken over. I'm sounding old here, but like you used to be able to rely on something like Google to just like get you the thing
that's what
that
I'm about to
would
say
be helpful, right? That was like the most searched or whatever. But like that's just not true anymore.
Every time I Google a question, like it'd be the most simple thing, like how do I hook up this microphone and process it through my computer, and it'll pull up 50 articles about a Shure SM48 microphone, and I'm like, this is not what I asked.
Yeah.
But if I ask ChatGPT, it just spits out the answer, So
correct. And so like, that's like a whole different thing, I guess. The Google thing, I got on a little tangent there, but I think ChatGPT has a place in education, and like, do I think we shouldn't use it? No. Like, I think it's a thing that's out there in the world. It's not going away. I think we should be learning how to use it effectively while not like when it is time for a kid to write, like that is an important skill.
Mm-hmm.
To be able to make a claim and provide evidence for why that claim is true. Like, I don't think you have to write 25-page research papers to be able to learn how to do that, but I do think that is like a valuable skill in the world.
Yeah.
Right. And so like, yeah, I mean, I think we should use ChatGPT for what it's good for, which is like, hey, I need to write a form email about something.
Mm-hmm.
Will you write this for me?
Yeah.
Man. ChatGPT, great. I don't have to think about it. I don't have to, I can go wordsmith the thing that's already written there than me trying to come up with like there are things it's really good at.
Yeah. I use it for check the block assignments. I can't lie. Cause I just get it. I don't know. Like college for me, it's been weird. Like coming in it's been weird, but also I'm glad that I'm coming in older. I'm about to turn 25 next month. I know college is different than what we've been talking about high school, but do you think college is effective? Because that's another thing we talked about last time with my last guess is how college is really good for, being successful and how everything's set up. But like, you don't have to go to college to be successful. It just makes it harder. You know what I mean? What do you think?
I think college, more so than high school, is like you get out. I mean, it's true of high school too, but you get out what you put into it in some sense, right? Like I think it could be great for networking, if you find great professors, it can be phenomenal. You know, my experience at the University of Washington was phenomenal. That was transformative because I had a series of professors who actually taught class in an authentic way to like what the real world was going to look like, you know? And so like to compare that, like I can give you an example, like that was graduate school. So like that was the first time in my life I ever felt like I was really getting a lot out of education. Like it was the literal first time I ever like was excited to go to class. Now outside, I had some like good individual college courses, right, in my undergrad, or some good individual courses in high school. But even as someone who was like successful student, you know, I was good at taking tests. I did fine on the ACT and all that stuff. Like but I was a terrible student. My product was fine, but I didn't study for tests. I didn't, you know, because I didn't need to.
Yeah.
And I always felt like school was not very challenging or, you know, informative for what I was going to need to do in the world.
Yeah.
And particularly like being a teacher, you know, I took a lot of history classes where I learned some stuff, you know, but like that's all on the internet now. Yeah, I don't need, I mean, seriously, right? Like I learned some like facts about things, and I was glad I took several of those classes because I'm interested in that stuff. But did it help me be a teacher? No. You know, what helped me being a teacher was teaching.
Right.
And so like teaching is a profession that I think actually needs more like internship, right? Like old school, like blacksmith and their apprentice more than go to college to learn how to be a teacher, right? The way to learn how to be a teacher is to be in a classroom.
Yeah.
And college basically prevents that until the very end, right? It's all about this other stuff.
Yeah.
But really the best way to learn how to teach is to teach, just like many things, right? Like if I'm going to learn how to be, you know, a movie producer or whatever, like I probably don't need to be in a classroom very much to learn how to do that. There's probably elements of classroom time, but is that really the best way to do it, is to spend 4 years?
For sure.
You know,
that's like everything. I mean, before leading up to doing this, I was reading about podcasts and trying to get it. Well, I had to just turn the camera on and just figure it out. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I do think there's a value in like, I think what people find value in with a degree, with a diploma, is that like this person committed to this. And that there's like a value in the commitment level of work over 4 years of college, right? To say, I can trust this person to like come into my place of business and like get some stuff done. But so many people do jobs that have nothing to do with their college degree, right? And so like, how effective is it? I mean, it's really about whether or not a person goes into any job open to learn how to do it, right? Motivated to work hard and be a good student at whatever it is that they're doing. You know, not just constantly sit around and be mad at their boss all the time or whatever.
Is there a better, I don't even know if there is, but is there a better way? Because when you're 18, you're faced with all these like critical life decisions, but it's like, you can't really wait super long, but that's why I'm glad I'm coming back older, because I know what I want to study now. But if I would have gone to college right after high school, I probably would have.
I think junior college is a good opportunity that, again, gets poo-pooed a lot. If you're like from a family where, you know, parents went to 4-year college and there's an expectation around like doing X, Y, or Z, people poo-poo junior college, right? Because they're like, oh, that's, you know, below. That's like something. Yeah, that's something else. That's not quite the level that you're capable of or whatever. And I think that's wrong. I think our society gets that wrong, right? I think we should be, if anything else, like it's really cheap compared to 4-year universities. You get an opportunity to actually operate independently in the real world and start to figure things out a little bit about yourself. And so if you are someone that's not sure, why not spend a lot less money and have a bunch of opportunities for classes, right, that are all over the place? Because junior colleges are doing dental hygienist training alongside like helping people do biology classes to get them into a 4-year university, right? So I think that's a good option. I think like I think the world could be better about going back to like in certain professions, the kind of like apprentice mentality.
Yeah, I like that. That's a good. Idea.
But again, if a state has said to be a teacher, you have to have taken this many hours in a class, right? And so like that bureaucratic buildup that has happened over time has like created a lot of barriers for innovation like that. And so like, whether it's in, this is all over the place in the United States right now. You could look at housing, for example. I read Matthew Yglesias quite a bit, and Matt talks ad nauseum about housing restrictions, right? And so like how hard it is just to get permission to like build a house or tear out a parking lot to put an apartment building in. And these are things that like have accumulated over time, maybe for good reason at one time, but now make it really hard to operate in the real world. And so like if something requires a 4-year degree, even if it's not really necessary, right? Like that is a barrier to potentially innovating on how we could get people into the workforce faster if that's their goal, right? Or like set up more apprentice-based programs, right, for certain job opportunities. So like, yeah, I think there's a ton of stuff we could do better, but we've built up a bureaucracy in many ways that almost forces people into 4-year university at some point.
I'm really glad you brought this up, because this is I had thought about talking about like red tape and bureaucracy with you as far as like just paperwork, and because paperwork is the bane of my existence. I hate it so much, but I've figured out I'm pretty good at navigating it now, and like kind of just you just gotta do it. But that's kind of one of the things that pushed me out of the Army, is just the paperwork and red tape was so immense. Like for the simplest thing, like taking leave, and this is just an example. You're talking about the housing, but like this is an example. But if I was gonna take leave, and it depends on your commander, but it gets to that point where I got to submit a leave form, plane ticket. I mean, just like 4 or 5 things, paperwork to do the simplest thing, and that's just one example. But
yeah. Well, I mean, working for Illinois State University, right, is not that much different. Like if I want to do professional development, there's a giant form that I have to go through to submit to my boss, right? And like it's not horrible, but it takes me more time than you would want.
Is it
right?
just like these rules are created and someone finds a loophole or goes around it to add on more and more and more? How does it got to this point where everything is so covered in red tape?
I think it probably depends a little bit, right? But like, so again, leaning on my like teaching actually here. So I also teach sociology, or have in the past, and I'm about to again in the future. And one of the things we talk about in sociology is like once a bureaucracy is created, essentially, right, it then works really hard, like without the people, right? It's not about individuals anymore. You've created this like institution that works really hard to survive. Okay. And so like now there's individual decisions being made, but a lot of that's because like, if you work in a bureaucratic environment, you don't want your job to go away.
Right.
And so like bureaucracy finds ways for itself to stay relevant, typically through writing new rules or procedures or whatever it may be. And so like, for example, in housing or in building in general, one thing that gets in the way a lot are these environmental regulations. Okay. Now, on the surface, everyone probably anywhere, if you said, well, hey, should we check to see if this is going to like negatively affect the environment before we build this project or whatever, this multi-million-dollar thing, most people would go, yeah, we probably should make sure that it's not going to like ruin the water, of a community or whatever. And so that simple thing of like, hey, when we build this new building, is this going to ruin a water supply or an aquifer or poison the soil because it's some factory or whatever, right? That like environmental regulation then can be wielded by people who don't care about the water but don't want an apartment building to go up next to them.
Yeah.
By saying, and then it costs an immense amount of money to have, a different organization come in, make sure, the project has to stop. How does this affect a flock of birds that flies by or whatever? And again, like, I'm not against that flock of birds, but like those regulations initially were put in place to be like, let's make sure we don't cause an animal to go extinct, ruin the drinking water, or poison the air to a point where, people are going to be coughing the second they walk outside. Right. And those have become these like insanely difficult things that make projects cost double what they might cost somewhere else. Right. And maybe take years and years and years to get through because, some ground moles or whatever live in this area and they have to be repopulated. And like, again, for the ground mole fans out there, like, I'm sorry, but like, that's not what those regulations are for.
Yeah.
And so like that to me is what happens most of the time is you initially have like a good reason for a rule going into place, but once it's in place, it's very hard to remove.
Yeah.
Right. And that is what happens. You keep adding layers over time and they're almost impossible to remove the layers. And so then you get this like crust of buildup, right? That slows everything down and makes things more expensive and less able to create innovation and things like that.
So with all these things, is like education, all the bureaucracy, is there if you could say a course of action moving forward of how do we start to peel back all those things, or how do we reform? Is it even possible, do you think, to get like an entire society to realize, hey, this maybe is kind of needs change?
Yeah. I mean, I think it is possible, but I don't think you can do it like in one clean sweep, right? I don't think one person or one Congress or one president or whoever could go in and snap their fingers essentially, and in 2 years, all the bad rules are gone, right? And I think this is where it's so one thing that I learned in grad school from Dr. Meredith Honig in our policy implementation class, that I was very thankful for having her specifically as my professor, and for that class, it has really helped me think about the question you just posed. And so like when you want to change policy, the ideas are easy to come up with, right? Mm-hmm. Lots of people can design policy changes, but the rubber meets the road in implementation. How does this thing actually get implemented in the real world? And so one of the things we read and talked about is about this term called street level bureaucrats. Okay. And so when you make a policy change, the people that you need to make sure that policy goes through in a way that it's intended is through the people on the ground who are doing the day-to-day job.
Sure. The low level.
The street level, right? And that's so like, so in education, for example, Common Core was this huge thing a handful of years ago, right? Everybody was talking about it. This big thing, lots of smart people were getting in the room and trying to figure out, exactly what kids should be learning. And if we can create this Common Core, then we can guarantee every kid in America, is getting essentially the same quality education.
I remember them talking about that towards my tail end of school.
But it's insane and bad policy because the people implementing it are teachers who aren't part of the conversation. And so when you create something like Common Core, a bunch of smart, PhD people are sitting around going, well, yes, 8th graders should learn this and 6th graders should learn this and all that. That's great. We should have high standards and rigor and all the things that Common Core was supposed to develop. Right. But at the end of the day, you're asking, thousands of math teachers or social studies teachers or English teachers. Well, it's not social studies because it probably wasn't part of the Common Core, right? Science teachers to implement this thing in their unique situation, right? That's unique to them. Also, that may contradict all the work that they've done throughout their careers and how they learned and how they learned how to teach, right? And so, like, what are most people going to do, especially if they're not part of the process? They're going to take this thing and they're going to go, how can I fit that into what I already do? Not,
Sure.
I'm going to change everything I do to make this policy work for someone else.
Yeah.
They're going to go, well, I already do this. I can take this little thing and fit that right into what I already do.
Sure.
And then they're just going to keep doing what they do.
Yeah.
Right. And so like that to me is like, if you're asking how could we make real change, is that you have to start at the like implementation, street level bureaucrat world. Like when you make a national policy, once Congress signs it into law, if that's it, if that's where it stops, nothing's going to change because the people doing the policy work, the people doing the ground level work, they're just going to keep doing it. They're just going to go, oh, here's this other box I have to check, like you were talking about, right?
I can relate to this so much, and it's different, but it's how we felt in the military a lot too, like about the higher ups just kind of sitting around and saying, oh, we should do this and this and this, and the sergeants at the E5 level who are the squad leaders, team leaders are the ones like doing the work. So I know exactly what you mean. It's different, obviously, but same premise. But I always had wished that they could just come down and spend time at that level, and just talk to the people. And for what it really is, not that like, oh, I'm trying to hear what you like. Tell me what I want to hear. That's what it was a lot of times. But is that the same way in education? Is there like higher ups, or how does that even work?
Oh, there's higher ups. I mean, and you know, I've never been asked to be on like a panel with the Illinois State Board of Education or anything like that. I'm sure they have teachers on those panels. But again, even if you brought 10 teachers, 20 teachers, 30 teachers, how many teachers are there in Illinois? Thousands, tens of thousands, right? So like, are you really thinking about all the unique scenarios that all those people are in and how this is going to affect or how they're going to interpret this? Because most people in education, I mean, there's like a running, I don't know, it's not a joke, but it's like a running cynicism that like, you know, every 3 to 5 years, there's going to be a new initiative that somebody springs up. It's going to be familiar to an initiative that was tried 15 years ago. It's just got a new name.
Okay.
Right. And like, we're going to spend 2 to 3 years doing professional development on it or whatever. And then there's going to be a new initiative.
Yeah.
Right. And some years there's 3 new initiatives. And that is what tends to get people to be cynical, who are like, well, why am I going to like work hard to implement this change when 3 years from now or 2 years from now, it's just going to change again. Instead, I'm just going to keep doing what I do, and I'm going to check the appropriate boxes that have to be checked.
Right. The minimum is possible.
I'm going to do the minimum amount possible. And then what happens? That policy doesn't work.
So they change it.
So then they change it. They try, someone else tries to do a new thing. And so like, it's just it's part of the policy cycle. And again, like, had I not gone and done grad school at the University of Washington with the people I did it with, I'm not sure I would have the same insight now that I do. So I'm like very thankful for that. And that was ended up being very important for my way of thinking about the world. But, you know, I think that is so important and so underrated because people assume when you pass a law, you change a policy, that change is just going to happen. All right. Or that it's going to happen overnight. And that's another thing. A lot of times it takes years for a change to really take shape. Right. But if you evaluate it and 2 years later it hasn't changed, people are like, well, it's no good. Well, the plan might have been, hey, it's going to take 5 years for this to really work.
Oh man, that's a lot.
So, like, to the heart of your question, could we do it? The answer is yes, but the problem is it's not a magic wand. It's not a person, right? It's a mentality, and it would have to pervade, you know, if we're talking about, say, the United States government, it would have to pervade the entirety of the United States government, right? It would take someone starting with the president, right, and working through their executive offices, because that's where the bureaucracy is, right? Congress isn't the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy is the executive branch. It's the State Department. It's the Department of Defense, right? It's the Department of the Interior that's managed our national parks, right? So you'd have to have a president that selects cabinet leaders who are then, right, interested in selecting people in administrative roles who are going to go out and like make sure the work that they're doing and the
Mm.
policy changes come from these street level bureaucrats, right? Like going to the people working the unemployment agency and going, how can we make this process better for individuals who need Social Security
Right.
or unemployment, right? Or like, how can we make sure that EBT, right, what used to be called food stamps, right, is like an effective program? Well, Congress isn't going to do that. The people who like work every day with the people who are receiving those
They're
government
gonna
services
know
are
if
going
it's
to
working or not.
are going to know what's needed,
Yeah.
right? Same with the Veterans Administration, right? You know, you're a veteran. I'm sure you have like experienced, I don't know, maybe great things, maybe problems in like the healthcare part of like being a veteran. But like there's, you know, nationally been a lot of issues with like veterans healthcare. Well, how does that get fixed? Well, probably not by the cabinet secretary, but probably by going and actually figuring out what on the ground level needs change to make the experience better for vets who are trying to like receive that health care, right? Because like, I don't know if this has changed, but 5-10 years ago, the VA was notorious for people waiting years
Yeah.
to get service on things that they had put claims in, you know? And so like, how does that change? Well, it takes people who have initiative, who want to change it, and then actually going and finding out what policy changes need to happen at the ground floor, right? And talking to those people. So like, is that possible? Yes. Is it probable, particularly in our current political environment? I would say no.
Yeah. Man, what do you think about like how everywhere I go around here, there's like help wanted signs? You think there's enough people to fill the roles, like to even to do all these things we're talking about?
Well, you're starting to throw some hard hitters out now. This is so like, you know, regardless of how you feel about some of our current president and our previous president, who are very different people, you know, President Trump cut legal immigration to like an all-time low in the United States. President Biden has slightly increased that to an extent, but he has kept it lower than it had been previously as well. And so like, part of the reason there are a lot of help wanted signs is we're in a phenomenal economy, regardless of how much people complain about inflation or whatever. We have had record lows in unemployment for like over 2 years, where the unemployment rate, I mean, has been below 4%. I mean, an acceptable unemployment rate, if you like pay attention to economists, is around 4%. And our economy has been running so hot for so long. Our unemployment is like hovering at 3.5 and below for over the last like 2+ years. I mean, that's a crazy amount of unemployment, right? Like low, crazy low. And so like, there is a lot of demand for jobs, which is why wages are going up, right? This is like the first time since I think the 70s, right? Now you're getting me to talk about something I'm not quite as much of an expert on, but like since maybe the 70s that we've had like wage growth that is like outpacing prices, for example, right? And so like those are like big positives for our economy, but the help wanted signs, those low are typically where at places with like low wage work that is typically done by either high school students, if it's like part-time work,
Okay.
or immigrants to the country, right? And so like a lot of people poo-poo immigration because of the southern border, and they think all immigration is bad. Okay, like no one in their right mind thinks that tens of thousands of people coming across the border is good for the United States. Okay, it's a bad way to run a country, right? Is to not know who's coming in and what they're here for and that sort of stuff. However, immigration in the history of this country has been an unbelievable positive, right? Both for our economics, our innovation, our diversity, our culture, and jobs.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so like we need more immigrants, just not in the way that like
it's happening.
it's happening.
Do you think that it's happening like it is in hopes to fill some of those low level jobs?
No, I think it's happening like it is because for two reasons. I think one, because there's so much economic instability in other places in the world, right? That like the United States is still a huge draw for people, right? Our freedoms, the economic opportunity that are here is still essentially unmatched anywhere in the world. And so like that's a huge like pull force. And then in a lot of places in the world, there's a lot of push, right? There's a lot of places where the economy is horrible, or they're in an authoritarian government, right? Or they're part of a minority group that's being slaughtered, killed, whatever, right? Like, and so if you're physically capable of getting the southern border and you know that there's a reasonable chance you can get into the United States and stay, it's worth the risk for a lot of people, right? And so like, do we need some changes at the southern border? I think it's evident that we do. But we also need changes in programs like H-1B1, which is like a visa program for highly educated people, right? We need to be bringing more immigrants into the country for the purpose of work and not necessarily just like having this, flood of people rushing across, right, in an illegal way where we don't know who it is, right? We don't know what their intentions are.
So what would you say as far as like if the economy, wages and stuff, wages going up, but also like housing market and stuff too, how does that, I don't know enough to really speak on it, but how does it all tie in as far as like wages in the housing market? Because it's kind of crazy right now as far as that goes.
Well, the only way I know is that I try to read fairly widely, if at all possible. And if these are things that interest you or others, I would point out maybe Matthew Yglesias or Noah Smith as good follows on Twitter, or formerly Twitter, X or whatever it's called now.
We'll put all our stuff in the description.
So Matthew Yglesias and Noah Smith are really good people to follow and read for this. They both have Substacks that you can subscribe to. I subscribe to Matt's. And so I get a lot of my kind of information on this from him. Another person who's great on housing is Jerusalem Demses. I believe she writes for The Atlantic. And so like there are people out there in the world that know this a lot better than I do. So this is just me kind of like talking about what I read from them. But like you have multiple factors at work in the economy constantly, right? And so like we had that big piece of inflation was at least in part a result of like all the money people were spending during the pandemic, right? Because we got 3 different stipends from the government, right? 2 under Donald Trump, 1 under Joe Biden, where they basically just sent money to people to spend in order to prevent the economy from crashing. Okay. So these were like responses to previous downturns in the economy where we went into, say, recession or the Great Depression, right? Is like one theory of economics is that if the government can basically spend enough money when people aren't, that can prevent the economy from going into a recession.
Just kind of keep the money flowing.
And keep the money flowing. So like that's like, so for example, that's a lesson that was at least somewhat learned from 2008. Okay. So in 2008, just briefly, there was a giant crash in the markets caused by, shady activity by banks and Wall Street on mortgages and mortgage-backed securities that led to a giant, pullback in the market where people, were losing money hand over fist through the stock market and in their retirements and things like that. Well, that caused a huge recession, in the teaching world, which is like right when I was graduating college, like teachers were getting riffed, right? Reduction in force, right? People were losing their jobs, all as a result of this like compression in the economy. So when the pandemic started and people were asked to stay home, right, and all these things were happening, economists tried to say, well, we just went through something similar to this in 2008, and the way to not let the economy go into recession is to actually like send people money to spend, right, so that they maintain their consumerism.
What qualifies the economy to be in recession?
You probably need to ask Google, the official, or ask ChatGPT based on what we talked about earlier.
What does it say? See if you can pull that up.
It's probably like a 10% pullback is my guess. I bet it's like 10% reduction in like the markets. We'll see if he can find it. But anyway, so the government basically, we lowered interest rate. We did all this stuff to try to prevent the economy from going into recession. That was successful. And so, like, even though people are mad about eggs being too expensive, right? Inflation was then the alternative result, essentially.
Okay.
Right?
The crash.
So we pumped all this money into the economy unnaturally, essentially, right? And eventually, we maybe did it one too many times because it's hard to gauge. It's a huge economy with millions of people, right? And trillions of dollars. And so, like, maybe the last one was too much. Maybe it was the second one, and combined, it's hard to say. But eventually, so much extra spending happened that it meant we were actually, like, we didn't have the lumber mills to produce enough lumber for people to buy it. Lumber prices went through the roof.
Wow.
Right? Like, people were doing all these home improvements all of a sudden.
Yeah, because they're all home, staying at home.
Yeah. And so, like, you had this situation where actually demand outpaced supply, and didn't just outpace it a little bit. It outpaced it so much that, like, we would have had to build new sawmills in order to match the demand. Well, people didn't want to build a new sawmill because they thought the demand was, like, temporary. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That's what caused inflation.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that I get it. That makes sense.
And so now, right, a lot of that inflation has at least leveled off, if not pulled back a little bit. Now, it still bothers me that, like, Honey Nut Cheerios cost $7 or whatever they cost. Like, that seems ridiculous to me.
Yeah.
But, like, groceries now are, like, they probably haven't gone back to what they were in whatever 2020 or 19, but they're, like, much more reasonable than they were even 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Right, when eggs were $8 and sold out everywhere.
Yeah, I was living in Hawaii
whatever
during
else.
COVID, so
oh my gosh,
it was insane.
It's crazy. But, like, there are a couple of areas, cars, housing, right, that still haven't quite leveled back off.
Is that because they weren't building as many homes during COVID?
Yes, and now going back, like, circling back to the bureaucracy issue.
Oh, yeah.
When it's hard to build, so you already have all these regulations in place, and now you've greatly increased demand, and then even people that want to build aren't allowed to build because of some regulation or some civic group trying to say, well, that parking lot's historic, right? And so we don't want to build an apartment building there, right? All of that makes existing dwelling places more expensive.
Do you know maybe Muja can look at something if the population is, like, getting bigger or not because the immigrants? Because is that another
slightly
factor?
But no, that's actually a huge issue potentially in the future. Is, like, so the United States, like, birth rates in the United States are not we would actually have a shrinking population if it weren't for immigration. Sure. Right? So, like, we need immigrants in order to, like, even maintain our population, much less, like, have it grow.
That's not surprising to me that, like, the population, not as many babies are being born as, like, more people are pursuing careers, and that's becoming more of, like, the thing.
It's a trend of a post-industrial society. So if you look at Europe or Japan, actually, is like a major example of this. Like, in Japan, they actually have a serious problem. Like, Japan, which is a place notorious for, like, wanting to keep Japanese culture and prevent, as much immigration as possible, is now, like, begging people to move to Japan.
Really?
Because they have so few young people. Yeah.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
China, actually, is, like, in population degrowth right now. One-child policy. And the effects of that. And so, like, the more educated a population becomes, the lower birth rates tend to be. And so, like, places in Europe, though, that have, parental leave and some other things, their birth rates have gone up. And so, again, something that Yglesias would say and that I would echo here is that, like, if we really want to start to be creative about, if we're interested in having families that have children in the United States, then our policies should support that.
Yeah.
And the fact that, like, people basically get 6 weeks off or none, right, when they have a child is, like, detrimental to actually getting people to want to have children.
Yeah.
Right? Having children is unbelievably expensive. The first couple of years are very challenging and stressful if no one can be at home.
Yeah.
Right? Daycare is expensive. And so, like, we have set up through our love of work an anti-have kids policy.
Yeah.
Right? So, like, anyway, there's, like, all this stuff. And that's why government and social studies and politics is so fascinating, because, like, when President Biden took office, it was like, all right, we got a Democratic House, a Democratic Senate, and a Democratic president. What can we pass? Right? And, like, it takes that in the United States to be able to pass anything. Whereas, like, in a place like the UK or Canada, their parliamentary systems, every election basically brings in a new group of people that can actually pass legislation. Whereas in the U.S., unless you have the trifecta, you basically sit there with your hands tied unless you can come up with some sort of bipartisan work.
Would you ever run for office, or do you want to coach? Is it because you think coaching forever is your thing, or you?
You know, I've thought about it from time to time. I honestly think the reason I don't run is because I don't know that I would want to get raked through the mud constantly.
Yeah. You think you'd have to start at like a entry level position, or?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. That's definitely something some people do, but then other people, you know, J.B. Pritzker was like a businessman and a billionaire, which I'm not, but, like, you know what I'm saying? Like, and then he was like, oh, I want to be governor. Okay, here, it helps to have $1 billion. I don't have $1 billion, but, like, he was never a politician, and then he was. You know, Pete Buttigieg was a mayor, and then he was running for president, didn't get the nomination, but, like, he was the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, and then all of a sudden he was running for president.
So what would you try
and
to
now
go for?
He's the Secretary of Transportation.
President? Would you try to run for president?
No, I would not go straight for the presidency. You know, I mean, no.
Maybe.
But I've definitely, I mean, the question is, if I would do it, is the answer to that is I have thought about it. I've considered it. I think I could potentially be good at it, but I'm not necessarily someone who I think would be a good politician in the sense of, like, winning. Like, could I win? Maybe. But, like, what I think I would be good at is the person who, like the chief of staff, the person who's, like, running the actual show.
Sure.
Right? Like, so
I figured you'd say something like that.
Because, like, you know, I like being the head coach. You know, I think I'm good at that level of it. But, like, being president is less about, probably, I mean, there's certain presidents probably do this differently, but, like, being president's probably less about, or even governor, less about being a policy expert and more about
The face
and being the deal maker and that sort of stuff. But, like, I think what I could probably do that, maybe, you know, I don't know. I think I'm not a very good bullshitter.
Well, then you wouldn't make it.
That's what I'm saying. I'm going to go up there and be like, look, this is how it is.
This is what I think.
Right. This is how I think it is. And maybe I think we need more of that in politics. That's what, like, makes me think I should do it at some point.
How do you feel about career politicians? Like, how does someone be I don't understand how someone could be a politician for their entire career. Because I feel like if you take, and I'm not saying anyone specifically, but let's say someone has been trying to earn a position their entire life. Like, for their career, they've been trying to earn this spot, and they failed. Wouldn't you think that they would eventually get to the point where they would become, this is what their life's work has been to earn this spot? Wouldn't they probably, I mean, I don't want to say probably, I feel like they would lean to any means necessary, or, like, try to
I think it does come down to, like, what their motivations are. Like, I want my doctor to be a career doctor.
Okay.
You know what I mean? Like, I want my surgeon to be a career surgeon. If I got to go to heart surgery, I don't want to be like, hey, this guy's working at AutoZone last week.
Yeah.
You know, he decided, you know, he's going to be a surgeon now. So, like, I think there is a benefit to having been in there a little bit, you know. I mean, look at some of the rookies or young-ish politicians. I mean, I hate to single out one side or the other, because that's not what I'm on this podcast to do, but I can't help but say, like, look at Marjorie Taylor Greene. Do you know who that is?
No.
You should look her up. She is a congresswoman from Georgia, and she seemingly has no interest in helping the United States like propel itself to a better future unless it like benefits her yelling on some video about something.
All right.
Okay. And look, I could give 10 examples probably of people like her, but she ran for office, I don't think, to be like a servant to the American people, but to like serve her own voice, right, and her own agenda, personal agenda, not like that of her constituents. She just happens to be loud enough and in a district that's like, far enough to her side of the aisle that like whoever is like the strongest, craziest person tends to get nominated, right? And so like the trend in American politics right now, because of how the primary system works, is basically for people on left or right to just go a little bit lefter or a little bit righter, a little bit crazier, a little bit louder, a little bit more obnoxious, a little bit more willing to say, I'm going to fight rather than I'm going to be a constructive politician who might give ground every once in a while in order to be better for the American people. Yeah, I'm going to go win and fight. And that has caused our Congress to basically be broken.
Yeah. I think that what you're saying about the divide in the aisle is really important because, and you take any of like the sensitive topics, like let's say abortion and I don't know, immigration. I feel like whichever side you fall on of the coin, let's say like if you're this side or this side, if you say I'm on this side of it, then people categorize you to be on that side of the aisle for every
single issue. Mm-hmm.
Why is it like that?
I can't say whether it's always been like that or not. I have a feeling that is people's tendency, but when you exist and live in a system of, two-party democracy, it does force a lot of that dichotomy, right? And so like right now there's no reward for people to walk across the aisle and work with the other side, right? Typically those are the people who, even though they might do something that's really good for the country, those are the people getting beat out of office by people like Marjorie Taylor Greene. All right.
Because their side rejects them for fraternizing,
for weakness, right? For fraternizing with the other side, right? We're giving Joe Biden a win or giving Donald Trump a win or whatever, right? And so like that level of combativeness, I think, is maybe what's different. Not that it's never been combative, but that level of like, I can't let the other side get one piece of legislation through, otherwise I've lost.
Yeah.
Right? Like that it's constantly what people call zero sum, right? That like I either win or I lose. That there's no way for like me as a Republican to work with you as a Democrat or you as a Republican to work with me as a Democrat. Like there's no way for that to like take place right now without people being like, because there's now conservative media and liberal media. There's no just media, right? There's like, so, the people on Twitter or the people on, whatever social media it's all kind of pushing you to a side.
So where do you think this goes? Because I mean, eventually, if it's going like this, something's going to have to happen. I would think it can't just go like this forever.
It can't. I do think there's like, I don't know. I could be reading the tea leaves wrong, but for example, I think it could still be pulled back together, right? And so like, a lot of people are like, "Oh, there's a civil war coming." Maybe it's like 3% chance and it was 1, right? That would be a significant increase.
Definitely.
But like, I don't think it's like 40%. I don't think that's true.
Yeah.
And like, I do want to say that like, even after the Civil War, like things weren't perfect. You had the black codes and some horrible things still going on in the South, but like the North still had a lot of segregation and racism too. But, in Lincoln's second inaugural, he talked about, binding up the threads of our nation. And like, I think we are still capable of that. I think there's some policy changes that could be made in terms of like how we elect people that could actually help with that. But then I also think I think people are just sick of the way it's going right now. And I think that matters probably more than anything because it does affect how people vote. Right. And ultimately that's what happens, right? Is like people go to the ballot box every 2 or 4 years and they get to vote and they get to say, here's the kind of person I want to represent me. And so like, for example, Mike Johnson, okay, is the Speaker of the House. I believe he's from Louisiana. You could check me on that, Mudra, if you want. But he was elected Speaker after the Republicans who control the House of Representatives kicked out the Speaker they first voted in because that Speaker had the gall to try to do a bipartisan thing with Joe Biden and the Democrats.
How can they just kick them out?
Well, each time a new House is elected, was I right? Did you find it? Is he Louisiana? Nice. I feel good about that one. So each time a new House is elected, they write rules about how the Speaker election is going to go and what it would take to oust the Speaker. Well, this group of what they call themselves the Freedom Caucus, but basically the 10 to 15 hardest right conservatives in the Republican Party, basically forced Kevin McCarthy from California, who was the first Speaker of this Congress, to basically neuter himself and basically allow any member of Congress to form a motion to vacate the speakership.
Oh, wow.
Right? And so basically it meant he was going to be unbelievably weak because any member of his party could start a vote to vacate his speakership. Right? And so like when he started negotiating on whatever the thing was, I forget what it was at the time now, maybe a year ago, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Matt Gaetz, this kind of group of very right-wing, hardcore, we're going to make sure everything that a Democrat proposes is going to lose, right, group of people ousted McCarthy. Okay, he got voted out of Speaker. In comes Mike Johnson after this, it was a whole thing. If you pay attention to politics, it was a very embarrassing kind of week or two for Republicans. They kicked the Speaker out, but then couldn't find anyone that they could all agree on to elect anyway. That Mike Johnson comes in and becomes the Speaker. Well, just this week, like just in the last 2 to 3 days, the Speaker, right, Speaker Johnson has been like going on a press tour, basically telling people like, hey, all the intelligence is pointing to China, Iran, and Russia all being in serious like coordination
Really?
on Ukraine, on Israel, right? And like that these 3 countries are really trying to destabilize the democratic world essentially, right? And take advantage of us and take advantage of the weakness of democracy. So Speaker Johnson, to his credit, supported a bipartisan aid package for Ukraine and Israel. Okay. Against the wishes of Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert, whoever the little cohort of 10 to 15 Freedom Caucus Republicans who are like, we will never vote for anything that a Democrat votes for, right? Or it's basically against their religion, essentially, right? And so like, so she has like been on a tirade against Speaker Johnson. I mean, you could pull up some of the quotes. She's saying some insane things, but all because like this guy had the audacity to say we're going to support Ukraine, right, against Russia. That it's in the best interest of the United States of America to help Ukraine win the war against Russia, right? But because that's also Joe Biden's position, the Speaker should not be able to have that position.
So it's less a matter of like what they actually think and more of a matter of that's what their side thinks. So I need to think the opposite.
Correct. But what I'm trying to say is I think it's a positive sign that Johnson resisted this, and eventually, even though it took him, too long, in my personal opinion, he came to the conclusion that like, hey, it's actually really bad for our country if we don't support Ukraine here, right? And they're like, that's a big boy decision, right? That's a decision of a leader who's in a position of power that could change the course of a war that will affect the United States in some way, shape, or form, right? And so, like, people may not agree with how much money we're given or this or that, but, like, people are like, well, why don't we spend that on food or education or poverty? Well, the United States has a lot of money in different pots that it spends. Should we spend more on certain things? Sure, that's like a different argument. But, like, right now, in terms of, like, international policy, we want Ukraine to beat Russia. We want, and this is unpopular on Democratic side of things, but, like, we want Israel, one of the only democracies in the entire Middle East, to beat back a terrorist organization. Are they doing it the right way? Maybe not perfectly, but it's a war. And, like, would we rather Hamas and Iran and Hezbollah and Lebanon, like, take control of Israel? That's crazy.
Not a chance.
It's crazy. So, like, the clear thinkers need to start winning some arguments.
Yeah.
And it does seem to me that more so than maybe 5 years ago they are.
I feel like, and maybe this will be the course out of this, because I agree. I love America for what it is. I hope that everything can kind of form back together. But with how things are going, I think best case scenario is it does force more of this. Like, people stepping up and be like, we have to do something different. Like, there's got to be something. It's so funny that, like, with studying the film class and, like, film and everything, I feel like studying film is really studying characters, which is like studying people. And it's so funny because I see, like, for example, the midpoint of a film is when a character experiences, like, a traumatic event, and then they have a revelation in the middle of it. And so I see maybe that's what will happen. Like, we'll enter a point that's even worse, and then Americans will be like, okay, we either can fix this or it's going to be even really bad.
Yeah. Well, I think, as you said you were 25, I'm 37. I mean, as people that, haven't experienced the world for as long as others have, we are not living through, this is not the worst time in American history.
Definitely.
This isn't even close to the worst time in the last 100 years. If you think back to the 1960s in particular, you had a president who was assassinated. You had his brother, who was running for president, assassinated. You had the face of the civil rights movement assassinated, Martin Luther King Jr. You had many other civil rights leaders assassinated, right? You had riots in the streets. You had National Guards having to help 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th graders get into school because a mob was trying to prevent a 4th grade girl in a dress from going to school with other white kids, right? Or, with white kids because she was black. And so, like, the country has been in harder times.
Yeah.
It's just hard for us to see that and remember it, I think. And know, and, like, but if you think about it, I grew up in the 90s and early 2000s. Pretty good.
Yeah, I agree.
And that was after all the craziness of the, 60s in particular, but even the
Vietnam.
50s and even the 70s, right? I mean, you had the Vietnam War. And so, like, there was a lot of tumult in the United States at that point in time. I think politics was different back then, but at the same time, right, you had, like, Lyndon Johnson, to me, is a president that is hard to figure out, because on one side, here's a guy from Texas who probably grew up around a lot of racism, who was, like, a key figure in passing major civil rights legislation. Because ultimately the civil rights movement convinced him that was the thing he needed to do, right? 1964 Civil Rights Act, 1965 Voting Rights Act, 1968 Civil Rights Act. Like, those are Lyndon Johnson things. Medicare, Lyndon Johnson, phenomenal president on one side. And the same guy, right, took us into Vietnam, escalated our presence in Vietnam. Right? Tried to hide things from the American people about Vietnam and how serious it was and what we were doing there. And so, like, what do you do? Like, what do you do with a guy like that in terms of his legacy?
Mm-hmm.
Is his legacy Vietnam? Is his legacy civil rights? Is his legacy Medicare and Medicaid? You know,
Wow.
but that's an American story, because our government, our country is big. We're involved in lots of things constantly around the world. We got lots of things going on here trying to fix ourselves, and yet we're doing all of them all at once.
Yeah.
All right. And so, like, things aren't great right now from a, like, political point of view. We got a lot of Americans that don't feel like they belong from multiple perspectives, right? Like, I would, where I grew up in Mattoon, Illinois, super conservative kind of part of the world. I think a lot of those people, that I've broken bread with, eaten meals with, talked to, played football with, right? They probably look around for the most part and think that, Democrats, people from cities, people who are a little more educated than them, just look down on them and don't treat them like equals or Americans. And that then causes them to, like, want to, screw the
angry,
libs or whatever, right? Whereas, people who live in cities or maybe don't fit the profile of, like, a typical traditional white English speaking, heterosexual, whatever, this or that, are looking around going, well, I still don't feel at home in a lot of circles in this country. And so, like, that dichotomy of, like, literal personal emotional feelings, I think then drives a lot of like how we vote,
Yes.
right? How we think about ourselves situated in the United States of America. All right. And that, like, if you have some of these people from Mattoon sit down with some people from a city and have a meal together, they probably get along just fine.
Yeah.
They might disagree about how many guns we should let people have or what abortion rights should be. Like, those are things people we're not all going to sing Kumbaya about those things. But are they seen as American in each other's eyes?
Yeah.
I think that, to me, is, like, one of the number one problems in our country today is we look around and we judge people who think differently as us as not true Americans.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is, like, the biggest problem we have to overcome is, like, I can disagree with someone politically or about an issue. That doesn't make them less American than me.
Sure.
Right? Or less important to the success of our country than me. It means we're going to vote differently, and that's fine.
One thing that I've learned a lot about myself doing this podcast, and I love doing it because I can just sit down and just talk to people. And I learned one thing about myself from watching, like, the first couple episodes to now is when I first started, I was really bad at listening. I was always trying to, like, I wasn't listening. I was hearing and thinking about what I was going to respond with to try to keep it up or press my point instead of, like, actually listening to what they were saying.
Hearing what others are trying to say. Yeah.
Exactly. So I wish there was more of that. I hope that there will be, but I don't know. It's one of those things that you kind of have to self-reflect and humble yourself on too, to be able to really sit down and listen. And college has done that for me too. I mean, in college, university, there's not many people who think the same as I do as far as, like, just foundational things. One of my professors, his name is Greg Beam. I respect him tremendously. We disagree on, like, a lot of, like, those things, but I respect him a ton because we can talk about these things. We can sit down and talk and kind of, like, I'll tell him, but I can't do it with the other students really. But with just him, I'll be like, this is what I think, and then tell me what you think, and then we kind of think about it and talk back and forth. Like, for instance, I have him for 2 classes, but one's an acting class, one's a screenwriting, and I had to go watch a production by ISU about just for part of the syllabus course material, just to go see a live performance. And there was a lot of things that I just thought just kind of were weird and just didn't really like, and I didn't hold back in my response to it. And he sent me like like 3 paragraphs about, like, what he thought, what I said, what he agreed with, what he didn't. So I don't know, just that open communication is so it's underestimated how much it can really work.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, to me, the thing that, if I have a worry, it's not necessarily that, like, politicians don't get along and yell at each other. It's that, like, more and more it's like, well, if I don't fit in the town I live in or whatever, then I'm moving to be around people I want to like we don't work very hard at trying to like break bread with people who disagree with us, right? And I think that like the division between educational attainment and how people vote, the division between cities and rural areas, that's not like totally new, but for example, the you almost always used to be able to depend on like the working class having oppositional voting habits to like the wealthier classes of people. And now that is like not necessarily true. It is much more based on your like educational attainment and where you live.
Yeah.
Right. Because of like the divide in the culture and not in the like economic interests of people. So like people are voting right now typically less because of their economic situation, which is partly because our economy is very good and we're a very wealthy country. And overall, like people have hard time saying this or admitting this, but like people's economic situations in general are just pretty dang good overall. Not for everybody. I'm not saying that, but like overall, people have enough stuff. To have a decent.
I know what you're
living.
saying, because it's like a quick story. When me and my friend went to Colombia, we went out to like the nicest restaurant, drinks, appetizer, steak dinner. It was like $30 for both of us. You know.
Yeah.
So we were like, because when we got there, or any foreign country, I've been to a couple foreign countries, but like they see Americans, they think that we're rich, and for like at first I'd be like, why do they think that? Like, I'm not rich. And then I go like spend money in their economy, and I'm like, oh, well, I am rich, you know. So
That's a great point, actually. And so like once people are at a certain level of like economic stability, or it doesn't mean they're all wealthy, but economic stability, then what are they voting for now? Right. And so like I think that's kind of what we're seeing a little bit too, is there's like a rebalancing of what is important to people when they show up to the ballot box.
Yeah.
And it's less about economics and taxation and more about
like
guns,
what they believe,
abortion, transgender bathrooms and things like that, right? And I think a lot of that is like there's a lot of misperception around a lot of that too, you know. And I think that's one advantage I have had in my life is like I grew up in Mattoon, Illinois, a rural area, but I've also like gone to university, lived in Seattle, one of the most liberal places in America, and so I've gotten a good cross section of the United States in my like experiences. And so I think, and being a teacher means I have students constantly from all different types of backgrounds and different ways of thinking, and you know, who are first generation Americans, you know, whose parents, you know, were immigrants. And so like I think that helps me gain a lot of perspective too, kind of like you were saying, going to Colombia, you know, and being in different places through the military. I think teaching is a gift in that way too.
Yeah. Well, Brody Walworth, do you have any like closing remarks, last things you want to say before we wrap up here? We've been going for a while.
I think it's time to wrap up, but I'm amazed that we didn't get to Star Wars or anything else. So I guess that means I have to come back on.
Oh my gosh, yeah, we have to do another one, because last year I did a May the 4th special, and May the 4th is next
2 weeks.
Yeah, so I don't know, maybe we'll have to do something. We'll have to do another one soon, though, for sure. You'll definitely have to come back on.
All right. I mean, I can talk about Star Wars just as long as whatever we just
Star
went
Wars,
today.
Lord of the Rings. Because there's not many people I could talk to about Star Wars in depth as probably we could.
Yeah, I'm sure we could. There's some ground to cover there.
But you know what's funny is me and Taylor did a Star Wars video game bracket style breakdown last May 4th. And it was actually pretty popular. I had more people come up to me saying I watched that episode than probably most of the other ones. So
yeah, nice.
People like Star Wars.
They do. Me too.
Well, thanks for coming on.
Appreciate you having me.
Yeah.